No one in that ballroom knew that within a few minutes an empire would begin to crack, and no one imagined that the man being laughed at in the middle of the celebration was the one who actually held the power of life and death over everyone in the room. The Crow Meridian Holdings Gala unfolded inside one of Vancouver's most luxurious hotels. Crystal chandeliers poured light over expensive suits and shimmering gowns, as if everyone there had been born into power. On stage, Sienna Crow stood tall, microphone in hand, wearing the radiant smile of someone just announced as the top sales director of the year. The entire hall rose to applaud. The sound of clapping echoed off the walls, the ceiling, and straight into her swelling pride. At the center table, Adrian Vale sat in silence. The tuxedo worth $1,200 fit him perfectly. The champagne in his hand tasted flat, almost empty. Adrian was not looking at the stage. He was studying the faces around the table, the people smiling, judging and comfortably treating him like a shadow. Richard Crow. Sienna's father occupied the head seat. He leaned back, nodding with satisfaction, like a king watching his heir shine. In his mind, this night belonged to the Crow family, a reminder to the entire city that Crow Meridian Holdings still stood above everyone else. Sienna finished her speech with confident words about effort, talent, and deserving success. Then she raised her glass. Her eyes swept across her colleagues, paused on her father, and finally locked onto Adrian. In that instant, the air shifted. Adrian felt it, a chill sliding down his spine. He knew that look well, the look of contempt wrapped in playful mockery. Sienna smiled deliberately, and her voice carried clearly, loud enough for the table to hear. "How does it feel, Adrian, watching me succeed while you do nothing at all?" 1 second of silence followed. Then laughter broke out. Not everyone laughed, but enough voices joined to form a wave of humiliation. A few people glanced at Adrian with discomfort, others with open amusement. One sentence, one clean cut. Richard laughed the loudest. He raised his glass as if his daughter had just told a perfectly timed joke. "Do not be so tense," Sienna added lightly, placing her hand on Adrian's arm, as though that gesture could soften what she had done. Adrian smiled. The smile did not tremble. It was not forced. It was calm enough to make anyone watching hesitate. In his mind, memories flashed by years of being underestimated dinners where he was introduced only as Sienna's husband, conversations where interest vanished the moment he said he worked as a freelance consultant. They did not know. None of them knew who he really was. Adrian set his glass down on the table, slowly and firmly. He looked at Sienna, then at each face, waiting for his reaction. Some expected him to laugh it off, to make a self-mocking joke, to continue playing the harmless man. Teasing can be fun. Adrian said, his voice low and steady. "Want to hear mine?" Sienna paused just for a breath, but it was enough. She had not expected that. In that moment, beneath the glittering lights, where shadows hid what the room could not see, invisible strings began to tremble. Old agreements, hidden transfers, signatures once thought untouchable. Richard frowned slightly, an instinct warning him something was wrong, but he dismissed it. Just a wounded ego, he thought. He had seen that before. None of them realized that the man sitting there, the one they believed did nothing, was the reason the company still existed. None of them understood that Adrian's silence had never been weakness, only patience. The gala went on. Music played. Glasses were refilled. Laughter continued. But beneath the polished surface, a truth was quietly rising. And when it finally surfaced, no one would be standing to applaud. The very next morning, the entire company knew he was the man who had been laughed at the night before. And not a single person knew that this same man was quietly holding the throat of the place they worked for. Crow Meridian Holdings woke up still riding the leftover excitement from the gala. Glass corridors reflected the early sunlight, desks gleamed from fresh, cleaning hot coffee, filled the air with its familiar scent. For most employees, it was just another normal workday. For Adrian Vale, it was the day he realized he had officially become entertainment. When Adrian walked into the building, several eyes immediately followed him. No one spoke, but the silence weighed heavier than any whisper. At the reception desk, two young employees murmured to each other, then abruptly stopped when he approached. In the elevator, a mid-level manager stood half a meter away, staring straight at the floor numbers, pretending Adrian did not exist. He was used to it. He had been used to it for 3 years. In the 14th floor conference room, Sienna stood before a large screen presenting the new quarterly strategy. Her voice was confident and sharp, every sentence carrying the belief that she was the center of the universe. Department heads nodded in rhythm. Some took notes, some smiled at the right moments. Adrian sat at the far end of the table. No one asked for his opinion. No one looked at him. In their eyes, he was just Sienna's husband, a freelance consultant with no title, no authority, no voice. Sienna glanced toward the end of the table as she wrapped up her presentation. Her gaze lingered on Adrian for a brief second. It wasn't affection. It was confirmation. A silent reminder that he was still exactly where she believed he belonged. Good, just make sure to expand the rollout in the western region, Sienna said, turning to the man seated on her left. Caleb Rourke, the regional vice president, nodded and smiled. His smile lingered too long. His hand rested on the back of Sienna's chair longer than necessary. Adrian saw everything. He always did. By lunchtime, the cafe on the ground floor buzzed louder than the espresso machines. People talked about Sienna's speech about the perfect joke from the night before, about Adrian's face when he had been turned into a punchline. "He does not look that bad," one employee whispered. "But honestly, living off your wife, you cannot really push back." The other laughed. "Yeah, classic guy left behind." Adrian sat near the window and heard every word. Not because they were loud, but because he had learned how to hear what people thought was harmless. His phone vibrated softly. A message from Sienna. "I will be home late tonight. Dinner with clients. Do not wait up." Adrian did not reply. He looked out at the street below, cars flowing past, pedestrians rushing along. Life moved normally, unaware that inside this very building, a secret powerful enough to destroy everything rested quietly inside an encrypted account, controlled by the man they called someone who did nothing. That afternoon, an internal email went out. Adrian's access to the financial analytics system was temporarily restricted due to restructuring. The explanation sounded reasonable, almost too reasonable. Adrian read the message twice. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. No surprise, no anger. Just another familiar step. Push him out. Make him invisible. On the top floor inside a glass office overlooking the bay, Richard Crowe stood by the window. He had just ended an unpleasant call with the board. Profits were stable, but pressure was mounting. Old investments were still not entirely clean. Caleb stood behind him, speaking in a reassuring tone. "Everything is under control. Adrian is just a minor detail. A failed husband cannot cause any real trouble." Richard nodded. He believed that. He had always believed that people without official titles had no real power. At the same time, in the underground parking garage, Adrian sat in his car with his laptop open, the screen glowing. The data he had downloaded earlier was still there. Numbers that did not lie. Circular transactions, inflated expenses, names repeating with suspicious consistency. He closed the laptop and took a slow breath. For a rare moment, sadness crept in. Not because he was underestimated, but because the woman he once loved had become part of the game, part of the contempt. That evening, Adrian returned home alone. The apartment was quiet, almost cold. He hung up his coat, poured a glass of water, and stood by the window, watching city lights reflect off the glass. They thought he had nothing. They thought he lived behind someone else's spotlight. They thought his silence came from weakness. But the truth was, Adrian Vale had never been silent, because he lacked power. He had been silent because he was waiting. And that moment had begun. That night when the entire city had fallen asleep, a single confirmed call pulled Adrian Vale out of the silence he had maintained for years. The phone vibrated on the kitchen counter close to midnight. Adrian did not need to look at the screen to know who it was. Some calls do not come often, but when they do, they always carry the scent of crisis. He answered without greeting. Richard Crow's voice came through the line, hoarse and tight, stretched like a wire about to snap. "Adrian, we need to talk. Right now." In that moment, Adrian closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but from memory. A buried memory clawing its way back to the surface. Years earlier, before Crow Meridian Holdings had its glittering galas, before Sienna spoke of him, with only rare traces of respect, Richard had knocked on the door of Adrian's small office, not as a father-in-law, but as a man about to lose everything. The memory carried Adrian back to that cramped room, dim yellow light, the soft hiss of the air conditioner. Richard sat across from him, hands tightly clasped an expensive suit, failing to hide the sweat gathering at his temples. "The company is bleeding," Richard had said. "Bad investments, projects inflated by hollow presentations, contracts signed simply to avoid looking outdated. Everything was collapsing, only no one was allowed to know yet." Adrian had listened. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. He saw what Richard could not bring himself to say. The fear of being pushed out of an empire that carried his own name, a fear stronger than bankruptcy itself. "I need someone behind the scenes," Richard said. "Someone with money, with a sharp mind, and most importantly, someone who knows how to stay silent." Adrian had asked only one question. "What do I get?" Richard stayed silent for a long time, then offered the one thing he had never imagined giving away: control. No one but Adrian knew. That night in that small room, Crow Meridian Holdings changed hands. Not in public records, not on announcements, but inside clauses written in cold legal language, signed by the trembling hand of a man on the edge of ruin. Adrian did not just provide capital. He built a structure, holding companies, layered ownership, nameless entities carrying real voting power. When it was finished, he was no longer an investor. He was the one who decided who stayed and who disappeared. Only no one knew. Back in the present, Richard's voice on the line sounded more fragile than Adrian had ever heard it. "The board is asking questions. The numbers no longer align. Someone is digging. Adrian, I need you to handle this." Adrian opened his eyes and stared into the empty space before him. City lights shattered across the kitchen glass in fractured reflections. He felt the reversal clearly now. The man who once stood above was pleading. The man once dismissed as useless had become the only lifeline. "You remember the agreement?" Adrian asked calmly. Richard swallowed. "Of course. I only hope you remember that we are family." Family. The word made Adrian smile without sound. Family was Sienna laughing at him in front of an entire table. Family was being called a minor detail. Family was believing power only lived in leather chairs on the highest floors. "I will consider it," Adrian said, then ended the call. At the same time, in another apartment across the city, Sienna sat before her mirror, wiping away the last traces of makeup from a client dinner. Her phone lit up with an email notification. An internal report had leaked. Numbers that did not make sense. Expenses that could not be explained. A cold unease slid down her spine. Not fear, but something unfamiliar, the feeling of losing control of the story. In the underground parking garage of Crow Meridian Holdings, Adrian sat in his car laptop glowing on his lap. He did not need to rush. Everything he needed was already in his hands. Files, signatures, voting rights, and most importantly, timing. They thought he was standing at the edge of the board, someone uninvolved, someone who did nothing. But the truth was, Adrian Vale had never left the center of the game. He had only stepped back far enough to let every other piece reveal its true nature. And when the light finally hit, no one would be able to pretend they could not see it. The board meeting was postponed indefinitely, with a single short email, and the entire Crow Meridian Holdings building fell into a silence that felt like a power outage. No one understood what was happening, only that an invisible hand had just tightened around the throat of the entire machine. That morning, Sienna walked into the office earlier than usual. Her heels struck the marble floor sharply, each step carrying her familiar confidence. But today, her eyes kept drifting toward the large conference room, where the glass doors were sealed and the curtains drawn tight. There was no laughter, no casual greetings, none of the small talk she once treated as proof of influence. Instead, a heavy quiet hung in the air, the kind that comes before a storm. She sat at her desk, opened her computer, and immediately saw her internal inbox erupting. Department heads were asking about a sudden audit. Mid-level managers whispered about a bank demanding explanations for an old loan. Everything was happening too fast and too cleanly, as if someone had pressed a button only they knew existed. Meanwhile, several floors below, Adrian stepped out of the elevator with calm composure. No one noticed him. No one greeted him. To them, he was still just a well-dressed man, moving quietly through corridors of power he was never invited into. Yet Adrian felt every glance sliding past him. The anxiety, the unease, a sensation he had known for years, except this time it did not belong to him. He stopped inside the records archive, where fluorescent lights washed over towering shelves of documents. Here, numbers did not lie. Contracts signed in haste, expenses disguised with elegant language. Adrian turned each file with the patience of someone who had waited a long time for this moment. There was no anger, no pleasure, only absolute focus. High above Richard Crow stood by the window, staring down at the city he once believed he owned. His phone vibrated endlessly in his hand, but he did not answer. For the first time in years, Richard felt his control over the company that carried his name slipping away, even his breathing no longer steady. He remembered the night before, Adrian's calm voice echoing in his mind, the way the call ended without promises. That silence was more frightening than any threat. Sienna left her desk and moved quickly toward her father's office, knocking and entering without waiting. Richard turned, his face so worn she almost did not recognize him. "What is happening?" she asked, still trying to sound composed. Richard did not answer right away. He looked at his daughter, then back out the window. "There are things you have never seen," he said slowly, "and there are people you have misjudged." The words landed like a fracture. Sienna felt something inside her give way. Adrian's image rose in her mind, silent at the gala, that unreadable smile after her cruel joke. She had believed she stood above him, that he lived on the margins. Now that certainty began to dissolve. By afternoon, the official notice arrived, a full internal review, an immediate freeze on strategic decisions. The board would be restructured. Richard's signature was nowhere to be found. Sienna's name was absent. Only cold legal language remained precise and final, leaving no room for resistance. As the sun set, Adrian stood alone in the underground parking garage, checking his watch and drawing a steady breath. This was not the end, only the beginning. But he knew from this moment forward, no one in that building could pretend he was invisible. Somewhere else in the city, Sienna sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel. For the first time in a long while, she did not know where she was driving. The feeling of victory had vanished, replaced by a vague fear, as if the familiar ground beneath her had been pulled away without warning. And in the spreading darkness, Adrian Vale moved without haste. He did not need to run. He had waited long enough to ensure that when the pieces finally began to fall, no one would be able to stand them back up in time. The call from the bank came before dawn had even touched the glass facade of the building, and with a single short sentence, the foundation of Crow Meridian Holdings truly began to shake. This was not rumor, not a warning. It was action. Sienna was standing in front of the mirror when her phone started vibrating non-stop. She glanced at the caller ID Internal Finance, then another call from legal support. Her heart began to race, not from fear, but from anger. In her mind, everything was still supposed to be under her control. She grabbed her coat, left the apartment in silence, and stepped into the elevator, wearing the face of someone accustomed to winning. But today, that face was beginning to crack. At headquarters, large screens flashed new alerts. A credit line temporarily frozen. A strategic partner requesting a delay on signing. Systems that once ran smoothly now stumbled. Employees gathered in small clusters, speaking more with their eyes than with words. No one knew who had made the decision, only that it had been approved at the highest level. Inside a private conference room, Richard Crow sat alone. He was no longer at the head of the table. The chair of authority stood empty. On the table lay documents delivered overnight. No explanation, no request for permission, only the familiar electronic signature he had once trusted completely. Adrian Vale. Richard closed his eyes. In that moment he understood that every path of resistance had already been sealed. The clauses he had signed in desperation had returned like a cold blade. He had believed he still held power because he remained the public face. He was wrong. Power did not live under stage lights. It lived in the silence behind them. At the same time, Adrian sat in a temporary office with no nameplate and no assistant. Just a simple wooden desk, a laptop, and natural light pouring through the window. He read each report with complete calm. The numbers were no longer tools for disguise. They were telling the truth. He knew Sienna would understand soon, not through explanation, but through the feeling of losing control, the same feeling she had once planted in him, through careless jokes, public smiles, and dismissive glances. Sienna walked into her father's office without knocking. Richard looked up, and his eyes no longer carried their usual protection. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper than usual. Richard did not answer right away. He studied his daughter for a long moment, weighing how much truth to release. Finally, he spoke a single sentence. "Adrian is no longer on the sidelines." The words forced Sienna back a step. In her mind, memories snapped into place. The meetings Adrian never attended, the questions he never asked, the smiles that never argued. None of it had been weakness. It had been certainty. That afternoon, another announcement followed. Senior leadership restructuring. Several roles suspended pending review. Sienna's name was absent from the interim leadership list. There was no personal explanation, only process. Sienna sat in her car, her hands trembling slightly on the steering wheel. For the first time, she felt what it was like to be written out of a story she believed she owned. No one called for her input. No one reassured her. Those who once laughed beside her now avoided her eyes. Adrian stood by the office window, watching the city turn gold at sunset. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a deep clarity. Everything was unfolding exactly as it should, not faster, not slower. He remembered the years of being labeled useless, the quiet moments of being mocked not to fuel revenge, but to remember why he had chosen silence. True power never needs to speak first. Outside, the city lights began to glow. Inside Crow Meridian Holdings, the familiar walls echoed with the sound of change. Not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. And at the center of it all, Adrian Vale remained standing. No one lifted him up. No one crowned him. Yet every decision, every legal line, every breath of the empire was now shifting along a path he had drawn long ago. Sienna's system access was suspended that same afternoon, and with a single emotionless notification flashing on her screen, the position she once believed untouchable collapsed completely. There was no explanation, no reassuring call, just a door closing quietly, yet forcefully enough to shake her entire world. She stood frozen at her desk, staring at the cold message announcing her access had been temporarily locked until further notice. Around her colleagues pretended to stay busy, but their eyes kept drifting toward her before quickly looking away. There were no greetings, no flattering smiles. Sienna felt the sharp reality of being pushed to the edge, a sensation she had never imagined she would experience. In her mind, one question repeated like knuckles tapping on glass. Who is Adrian really? Not the quiet husband who always stood behind her, not the man she dismissed as unambitious, but the one who had silently held every string. The thought tightened her chest, not only because of lost power, but because she realized how deeply wrong she had been for years. Richard called her when evening had already settled in. His voice was low, stripped of its usual authority. "Come home," he said. "We need to talk." When Sienna stepped into the house, she once viewed as a symbol of stability, it suddenly felt unfamiliar. Richard sat in the living room, thick folders spread out before him, the warm yellow light revealing new lines etched into his face. "Do you know what Adrian has done?" Richard asked without looking up. Sienna stayed silent, no longer certain of anything. Richard continued slowly, as if each word weighed more than the last. "Adrian did not just save the company. He owns the company. Voting rights, decision-making power, everything." Sienna sank into a chair, feeling as though the air had been drained from the room. In that moment, every small detail she had once ignored snapped into place. Adrian's refusal to argue, his vague late nights, his calm expression when she bragged about her achievements. None of it had been weakness. It had been control. At the same time, Adrian was seated in a virtual meeting with his legal advisory team. The screen was divided into multiple frames, each face representing a different sphere of influence. The atmosphere was focused, not tense. Adrian spoke sparingly. When he did, everyone listened. No interruptions. No doubt. This was not a man stepping into power for the first time. This was someone who had lived with it for years. He ended the meeting with a single sentence. "We stay on course. No need to rush. No need to compromise." The screen went dark. Adrian leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes briefly. There was no bitter satisfaction in him, only a quiet sense of release. At last, he no longer had to shrink himself to fit someone else's expectations. That night, Sienna lay awake in her old bedroom, the familiar ceiling above her, feeling distant and strange. Her thoughts returned to the gala, the careless remark, Adrian's unreadable smile, when she mocked him. Back then, she believed she stood at the peak. Now she understood that was the moment she pushed herself down. Across the city, Adrian stood on his apartment balcony, watching the lights stretch out like veins through the urban sprawl. He thought of Sienna, not with anger, but with a late-forming understanding. He had loved her. That part was real. But love cannot survive when one person must always stand above the other, to feel worthy. The next morning, an official announcement was released. Adrian Vale was appointed interim strategic representative of Crow Meridian Holdings, a title vague enough to avoid panic, yet strong enough that no one could ignore it. The stock stabilized. Partners paused their withdrawals. Order slowly returned in a new form. Sienna read the announcement in silence. There were no tears left, no anger, only a deep emptiness. For the first time in her life, she did not know what her next step would be. And while the entire empire learned to adapt to the true power behind the curtain, Adrian moved forward without noise. He no longer needed to prove who he was. Everything that mattered was already speaking for him. News of Adrian Vale becoming the strategic representative spread beyond the building faster than any press release, and overnight whispers turned into genuine fear. Not fear of change, but fear of a truth that had just been torn open. That morning, senior executives entered headquarters with guarded expressions. Those who once spoke loudly now kept silent. Office doors closed earlier than usual. Adrian walked through the long corridor lights reflecting off the glass walls, yet no one dared to meet his gaze. Not because he threatened them, but because they were beginning to understand how badly they had misjudged him for a very long time. Inside the main conference room, Adrian took a seat with no title, no nameplate, no ceremonial authority. But when he spoke, the room fell completely still. He did not raise his voice. He did not use sharp words. He simply asked clear, precise questions, each one striking like a needle at the weakest point of every department. Unexplained expenses, projects that existed only out of habit, positions preserved by relationships rather than competence. Each question landed like a clean cut. No blood, but pain, all the same. Richard sat at the far end of the table, his hands tightly clasped. He no longer argued. He no longer tried to maintain appearances. Inside him stirred a strange mixture of regret and awe. He remembered every time he had dismissed Adrian, every polite nod, every careless joke. Now those moments returned as bitter reminders. True power never needs to announce itself. Elsewhere, Sienna stood before the glass wall of her apartment, staring down at the city below. Her phone remained silent. No emails, no meeting invitations, no messages checking in. The world that once revolved around her had turned away with startling speed. She remembered standing on stage lights, blazing applause, rolling over her like waves. She had believed that was power. Now it felt like an empty memory. She opened her laptop and reread old reports, past achievements she once took pride in. They were still there, but their meaning had changed. For the first time, Sienna asked herself whether she had truly built anything at all, or if she had simply stood on foundations someone else had quietly constructed. That afternoon, Adrian signed off on a critical decision. No mass firings, no purge, just realignment. The right people placed in the right roles. Layers of display stripped away to reveal the true structure underneath. Those with real ability began receiving opportunities. Those who survived on words alone started to feel the ground shift beneath them. Rumors spread quickly. Adrian was not impulsive. Adrian was not reactive. Adrian did not play the old power games. That unsettled people more than anything else. A man who shouts can be challenged. A man who sees everything in silence cannot. That evening, Adrian left the building late. He paused briefly at the entrance, looking up at the upper floors where lights still burned. He felt no sense of victory, only responsibility. True power is not revenge. It is deciding what to do when you finally have the ability to change everything. Across the city, Richard sat alone in his old office. He opened a bottle of wine, but did not drink. In the reflection of the mirror, he saw a man who looked older than his years. For the first time, he accepted that the empire he once took pride in no longer belonged to him. And strangely, within that loss, he felt a quiet relief. Perhaps the burden had never truly been meant for him. Sienna turned off the lights in her apartment and lay in the darkness. She did not cry. There was nothing left to cry over. In her mind, one thought remained sharp and painful. The man she had once looked down on was the only one who had truly understood the game she always believed she was winning. And as night settled over the city, Adrian moved forward at an unhurried pace. No one applauded. No one called his name. Yet every movement within Crow Meridian Holdings was now shifting according to the rhythm he had set. This time, not because he wanted to be seen, but because he was ready to take responsibility for everything that would come next. An anonymous audio recording appeared in the inbox of the Internal Oversight Board at midnight, and within just a few short minutes, truths that had been buried for years began digging their own way to the surface. This was not a threat, not speculation, it was evidence. The next morning, the atmosphere inside Crow Meridian Holdings shifted completely. The vague whispers were gone, replaced by fear with a clear shape. Faces that once carried confidence tightened, and those who believed they were untouchable began reviewing every email, every signature, every past decision. Adrian entered the building as he always did. His stride unchanged his gaze, calm, but he knew that today marked the beginning of a different phase. Inside the oversight office, the recording was played again. A familiar voice, unmistakable and clear. Instructions given in private expenses, legalized through elegant wording orders, never meant to exist on paper. The room fell silent. No one needed to ask Adrian where the recording came from. They only needed to watch how he listened, as if he had known its contents for a very long time. Richard was summoned later that morning. He sat in the chair across from them, his back straight, but his shoulders heavy. When the recording played, he closed his eyes not in shock, but in recognition that there was no path left to retreat. What he once believed was control had become a burden. He understood that without Adrian, everything would have collapsed much earlier. Sienna received the news through a brief phone call. The voice on the other end was emotionless, informing her that the internal investigation had been escalated. She set the phone down on the table, her hand trembling slightly. In that moment, she understood this was no longer a conventional power struggle. This was the moment when truth chose who would remain standing and who would be left behind. She thought of Adrian, of the times he stayed silent while she spoke too much, the moments he left the room before conversations turned toxic. Back then, she believed he was weak. Now she began to understand that he simply never needed to play those small games. That afternoon, Adrian called a brief meeting. No crowd, no media, only those with real responsibility. He did not accuse, did not claim credit. He stated one principle clearly. From this point forward, everything would be transparent. No exceptions, no gray zones. His voice was low and steady, and no one objected. A long-serving executive asked him why he had waited until now. Adrian looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because power is not about seizing the moment, it is about choosing the moment when no one can deny the truth. The answer left the room silent. That evening, Sienna sat alone in her apartment, city lights casting cold streaks across the ceiling. She reopened old messages, words she once wrote with absolute confidence. Each line now felt like an accusation turned back on herself. For the first time, she did not blame anyone else, not her father, not circumstance. She began to face her own choices. Adrian left the office after night had fully settled. He did not go straight home. He walked for a long stretch, feeling the rhythm of the city breathe around him. There was no sense of victory in his mind, only clarity. What he was doing was not about destruction, but about ending a cycle of decay. Elsewhere, Richard sat in a familiar room, holding a file he had never opened. He knew that tomorrow names would be called, positions would vanish, and this time no relationship or reputation could save anyone. He accepted it. Perhaps this was the cost of closing his eyes for too long. As night closed in, Crow Meridian Holdings was no longer a place where secrets were safe. The walls still stood, but behind them, light had begun to reach the darkest corners, and Adrian Vale, once dismissed as an outsider, was now the only one who knew exactly where every piece belonged. not to control them, but to ensure that this time, once the truth was exposed, no one would ever be able to bury it again. The summons from the federal agency was issued early in the morning, and in a single moment, those who once believed they were beyond reach began to understand that the rules of the game had changed. No more internal handling, no more quiet resolutions. The legal doors had been thrown open. At Crow Meridian Holdings, the air thickened like the moment before a storm. Employees arrived with a different posture, conversations, shortened eyes, avoided one another, footsteps, hurried. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed. This silence was not vague fear. It had a name: accountability. Adrian entered the conference room with the federal legal team. There were no extended handshakes, no introductions, just exchanged looks enough for everyone to understand where each person stood. He placed the file on the table. No decoration, no commentary. Inside were transaction chains. Shell companies' money carefully rotated through layers of intermediaries. What had once been called strategy now revealed its true nature. An investigator asked how he knew exactly where to look. Adrian answered calmly, because some people do not see what they do not want to see, and I have been looking for a very long time. The reply carried no anger, only truth. On another floor, Richard sat in a waiting room, hands resting on his knees. He was no longer a decision-maker, no longer a coordinator. He was simply a man facing the consequences of years of compromise. When questioned, he answered fully without resistance or evasion. Deep down, he understood that more silence would only make everything worse. Sienna stood outside staring at the familiar building that now felt like a different place. She was not summoned. She was not interrogated. Yet the feeling of being excluded from everything cut deeper than any question. She realized she no longer belonged at the center of any narrative. The power she once held dissolved so quickly it left no echo. News began to spread, not through sensational headlines, but through dry notices. Federal investigation, full cooperation, review of individual accountability. Each phrase felt like a period ending an era. Adrian signed the final cooperation document with the investigators. There was no smile, no sense of victory. Only a strange calm settled inside him. He knew that from this moment on, there was no turning back for anyone, and he did not wish for one. In the afternoon, Adrian walked out of the building, sunlight reflecting off the glass facade, onto a city moving as usual. Inside, however, everything had changed forever. He received a short message from a junior employee, thanking him for doing the right thing. Adrian stared at the words for a long time. That alone made everything worthwhile. Sienna returned to her apartment, removed her shoes, and sat on the floor. She did not turn on the lights. In the darkness, she faced a question she had always avoided. If there was no power, no admiration, no status, then who was she? The question had no immediate answer, but it was there, clear and impossible to ignore. Night fell, and cars left the Crow Meridian Holdings parking lot more slowly than usual. No one hurried. No one wanted to be the last. In that stillness, Adrian paused, looking up at the sky. He did not think of those who had fallen. He thought of those who would no longer have to bow under secrets that were never theirs. True power does not lie in controlling the outcome. It lies in daring to bring things into the light, even knowing that the light will burn everything you once protected. In that moment, Adrian understood that the road ahead would not be easier, but it would be the right one. The emergency board meeting was cancelled in less than 10 minutes, and a single brief notice was enough to leave the entire building in a state of paralysis. There were no more voting rights, no more privileges, no more safe zones for anyone who once believed they stood above the rules. That morning, Adrian arrived earlier than usual. The hallways were still lit, but the familiar fake laughter and polite small talk were gone. Everything felt heavy, as if the air itself carried the memory of mistakes that had just been exposed. He walked slowly, not from hesitation, but because he knew every step now carried the weight of change. Inside the main conference room, the chairs that once symbolized power sat empty. Only those forced to face the truth remained. Adrian took his seat and placed the file in front of him, his expression calm. No introductions were needed, no display of authority. Everyone understood why he was there, and more importantly, why they no longer had the right to look down on him. A long-serving board member spoke up, his voice rough with tension. He asked whether there was still a way to salvage the company's reputation. Adrian looked at him for a long moment, long enough for the entire room to hold its breath. Then he answered slowly and clearly. Reputation cannot be saved through concealment. It only exists when the truth is accepted. Otherwise, it is nothing more than an empty shadow. The words cut through the room like a blade, severing the last remaining illusions. Some lowered their heads, some closed their eyes. Others clenched their fists, trying to hold on to power that had slipped away long before they realized it was gone. Elsewhere in the city, Sienna sat in a small cafe, a cup of coffee cooling in front of her. She watched people pass by, feeling as though she stood outside a world that once revolved around her. The news no longer spoke her name with admiration. There were no flattering titles, no praise, only a long, cold silence. For the first time, she understood how fragile the attention she had lived on truly was. When it disappeared, she no longer knew who she was without it. Back at headquarters, Adrian signed the decision appointing the interim executive team. New names, unfamiliar faces. People who had never appeared on magazine covers, but who carried real capability. A young assistant stood beside him, hands trembling slightly, as documents were passed over. The admiration in that person's eyes was impossible to hide. Adrian noticed it and gave a small nod. He understood that feeling the moment when justice stops being an abstract idea and becomes something tangible. The afternoon passed faster than any other day. News spread beyond the building, not loudly, but with undeniable force. Partners began adjusting their tone. Those who once avoided contact now reached out. The world does not change for one individual, but it always responds when the balance of power shifts. As dusk settled over the city, Adrian stood alone by the office window. Below, traffic continued to flow, life moving forward as always. He thought about the years of being underestimated, of being treated as someone on the sidelines. He thought about the dinners where he was seen as a shadow, the laughter never meant for him. None of it disappeared, but it no longer defined him. He left the office after night had fully fallen. There was no entourage, no flashing cameras. Just a man walking through the city carrying a quiet sense of relief. True power, he realized, is not about making others afraid. It is about remaining steady when all masks fall away and still choosing to do what is right, even when the road ahead promises nothing but difficulty. That night, in different corners of the city, those who once stood at the top were forced to confront themselves. And at the center of all these silent shifts, Adrian knew this was not the end. It was simply the moment the story turned a page into a chapter where the truth would no longer be pushed into the shadows, and those once dismissed would finally be seen for their true worth. The formal indictment was announced on a gloomy morning, and within just a few short hours, names once celebrated became symbols of collapse. There was no more doubt, no way back. The final door had closed. At the company headquarters, the atmosphere was stretched tight, like a string about to snap. Employees who once walked with raised heads now lowered their eyes quietly, clearing their desks. Whispered conversations spread through the hallways, no longer rumors, but exposed truth. Adrian appeared in the middle of it all with a calm that felt almost cold. He did not need to say a word. His presence alone answered every question. Inside a closed meeting room, the lawyers laid out the final details. Each action, each wrong decision, each hidden transaction was brought into the light. Those who once believed they were smarter than the system now sat in silence. Adrian listened, his gaze steady. For him, this was not a moment of revenge. It was the inevitable end of a long chain of choices made in the wrong direction. Richard was escorted into the room with heavy steps. He was no longer the powerful man who could silence a room with a single command. Now he was simply a person facing the consequences of compromise. When the final question was asked, he looked toward Adrian. In his eyes there was no hatred left, only late acknowledgement. He understood that the one he had always underestimated was the only person patient enough to wait until the truth spoke for itself. Elsewhere, Sienna sat alone in the empty room of her old apartment. Photographs of success that once hung proudly were now turned face down on the table. Her phone was silent. No congratulatory calls. No party invitations. She reread old messages, sarcastic remarks, careless words that now echoed like accusations. For the first time, she truly felt the cost of stepping on others to elevate herself. That afternoon, Adrian signed the final decisions tied to the restructuring process. Favored names were crossed out. Those who had worked quietly were given their chance. A young female manager stepped out of the meeting room with red eyes overwhelmed with emotion. She had never believed her voice would be heard. Adrian said only one short sentence: "True ability does not need to shout." That sentence spread faster than any headline. As dusk fell, Adrian stood on the balcony watching the city change color under the fading light. He remembered the days of being treated as invisible, as a shadow at glamorous dinners. He remembered being underestimated to the point that no one bothered to ask what he thought. Those memories no longer hurt. They had become the foundation of his strength. That night, the evening news mentioned the case in a neutral tone. No sensational headlines, no judgment, only facts recorded. Adrian turned off the screen and leaned back in his chair. In that rare silence, he allowed himself to breathe more slowly. The road ahead was still long. Doing the right thing had never been easy. In different rooms across the city, people who once stood at the top began asking themselves where they had gone wrong. Not because they lost power, but because they had lost the ability to see others as equals. And in that quiet current, Adrian knew this chapter was nearing its end. Not with applause or praise, but with a simple truth. Real power does not come from forcing others to bow, but from standing firm when every illusion collapses. He stepped away from the balcony, turned off the office lights, leaving behind a space that had once been the center of deception. As the door closed, Adrian knew that tomorrow would no longer be a battle to prove himself. It would be a journey of rebuilding, slow but honest. And that was the greatest victory of all. The call came just as dawn touched the horizon, and with a single short sentence, Adrian knew everything had finally closed. There would be no more emergency meetings, no addendums, nothing left hidden behind closed doors. That morning, the city woke with a different rhythm, not louder, but clearer. Adrian stepped onto the balcony of his new apartment, where sunlight spilled across glass buildings and reflected into soft bands of color. He took a deep breath, not the breath of victory, but the breath of someone who had finally walked out of a storm that had lasted far too long. At headquarters, the final changes were completed. New nameplates were installed. Departments reorganized old processes, stripped away like cracked, lifeless skin. Decisions were no longer driven by relationships or flattery. Only standards, responsibility, and transparency remained. Employees who had once stayed silent now spoke with a different tone, more direct, more at ease. Some smiled, some exhaled in relief. Some simply stood still, realizing they had been waiting for this moment for longer than they dared admit. Sienna left the city on a windy afternoon. She made no announcement, no post, no farewell. Just a neatly packed suitcase and one last glance at the place that had once fueled her ambition. Inside her, there was no familiar anger, no lingering arrogance, only a quiet emptiness, and within that emptiness, for the first time, she understood that a person's value is not measured by stage lights, but by how they treat those beside them when no one is watching. Richard signed the final agreement with slightly trembling hands. He did not justify himself, did not resist. As he left the room, he turned back toward Adrian and gave a slow nod. Not an apology, not a challenge, but a late acknowledgement that some people are strong, not because they speak loudly, but because they are patient enough to wait until the truth walks into the light on its own. Later that afternoon, Adrian walked through a small park. Children ran past laughing. Elderly couples sat on benches talking softly. Life continued indifferent to the power struggles that had ended somewhere behind the tall buildings. He stopped, watched the trees sway gently in the wind, and realized this was the real reward. Not titles, not authority, but peace, the kind that comes from no longer having to hide who you are. That evening, Adrian sat alone in a softly lit room. He reopened old notes plans once written in silence when no one believed he was capable of anything significant. Each line reminded him of a simple truth. Being underestimated is not a curse. It is an advantage. When no one is watching, you have time to build, to learn to observe who people truly are. He closed the notebook, stood up, and turned off the light. Tomorrow would be an ordinary day, and that was exactly why he smiled. No climax, no stage, just a new journey where decency and real ability could exist side by side. This story does not end with an explosion. It ends with a meaningful silence, the silence of those who once looked down on others, the silence of secrets with nowhere left to hide, and the silence of a man who could finally live true to his own worth. If you have ever been underestimated or overlooked, remember that sometimes the greatest strength lies in not needing to prove anything right away. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us which part of this journey made you reflect the most. Do not forget to like the video if you felt the message and subscribe to the channel to continue following stories where the truth always finds its way into the light.